This is Jerry Fry, audio historian of the Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. The following is the professional history of a PPB member told by himself in his own fashion on this day, August 7th of 2006. These interviews are being audio taped in order to compile firsthand a living history of the members of our organization and the stories of their professional experiences. Many of our members began in what is called the golden age of radio and television, and this is an attempt to preserve as much data as possible for succeeding generations. This recording is not intended for broadcast without first obtaining permission from Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. And with me today in Hollywood is David Dow, formerly of CBS News, and now on the board of PPB, Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. David, every time I hear your name, I keep thinking I should be hearing you on KNX on the hourly newscast. Let's start at the very beginning and find out where you were born and reared and go from there.
Well, I'm what used to be a rarity in this state, a native Californian. In fact, on one side of my family, I am a fourth-generation descendant of a pioneer Californian.
Really?
One side of my family arrived here just after the gold rush in 1851, and I grew up in, I suppose, an unlikely place to begin or to even think about a journalistic career. Little town of Auburn, California. It was little then anyway, about 4,000 people up in the gold rush country.
Beautiful country.
Great country.
Not so little anymore up there.
No, it's become kind of an extension of Sacramento the last time I was there.
Yeah. No, I was up there last year, and the changes in the 10 years that were preceded my visit last year were certainly very evident. Lovely area. So, you are a native Californian, as is my wife, and one of the few people that I've met who is. You grew up in Auburn?
Grew up in Auburn, at least spent the first 11 years of my life there, and I suppose in a broad sense had my first taste of journalism in Auburn. I remember being the sixth grade correspondent to the Auburn Journal, the weekly newspaper. And I think the first time I saw my byline in print, I was hooked.
Yeah, that's thrilling.
And I'm one of those rarities. I'm somebody who started out early in life with an idea of what he liked to do in life and was fortunate enough to live it out.
Yes, I think people like that are indeed fortunate. Did you take journalism in high school?
I was, as a matter of fact, I was a sports editor of my high school newspaper. I went to high school in Sacramento. We moved to the big city when I was almost 12 years old, and was sports editor and editor of my high school newspaper. And in those days, broadcasting wasn't even a gleam in my eye. There wasn't a hint of that in my future. Somebody asked me what I wanted to do in life. I told them I want to be the editor of the New York Times. And I was very print-oriented and used to pick up a little pin money in my last year in high school by covering prep sports for the Sacramento Bee as a stringer. I think it was the grand total of 25 cents an inch.
Wow.
And usually the number of inches that I wrote got chopped down to fewer inches by the time they got in the paper.
What high school did you go to in
Went
Sacramento?
to C.K. McClatchy Senior High School, which McClatchy, of course, is a famous name in the world of journalism. And I later would wind up working for the McClatchy organization in Sacramento as a newspaper reporter for the Sacramento Bee. While I was there, the Bee, or the McClatchy organization, acquired its second television station, which was KOVR TV in Stockton, Sacramento, an ABC affiliate. And it had kind of a rundown news department.
Yes. And
the McClatchy organization decided that they would try to beef it up, drawing from its newspaper talent, and began trying to lure certain people away from the newspaper newsroom over to KOVR's newsroom. And one of those who was an early transfer was Clark Biggs, who went on to become a news executive for several stations in San Francisco, and later the voice of the California Farm Bureau, the spokesman for the California Farm Bureau.
Right.
Another was Warren Alney, who has made a big name for himself in this market, Los Angeles, working for several television stations, and now with what may be the longest-running news-oriented radio show in town. for KCRW, Which Way, L.A., and a guy with a very devoted following out there. He went over to become the state capital correspondent for KOVR, and I succeeded him in that job.
Oh, you did?
And talk about you were mentioning the golden days of broadcasting. This was certainly, if not the golden age of California politics, it was one of them.
Yeah.
I began covering California politics with the inauguration of Governor Ronald Reagan.
Really?
And of course, there were those wonderful confrontations, those wonderful duels between what eventually would become rivals for governor. Ronald Reagan and Jess Unruh, who was the very powerful Speaker of the State Assembly. And there was a wonderful cast of characters in Sacramento in those days. And of course, Reagan was touted as a presidential candidate from the day he took office as governor of California. And they were exciting times. It was a good place to not only cut your teeth in broadcasting, but to ply the trade of journalism. It was a civics lesson a day.
What year did you begin working for the newspaper?
Actually, the Bee was the second newspaper I worked for.
Oh, really?
I worked right out of college. I worked for a year for the San Diego Union, and there was a draft in effect in this country at that time.
Yeah.
And I beat the draft by enlisting in the Navy in an officer's candidate program. Spent 3 years and 10 months in the Navy, and part of that as a public information officer, which helped me keep my hand in at least a journalistic related activity. Came out and got the job with the Bee, and went on from there to KOVR and to the McClatchy broadcasting chain.
Where did you go to college?
Went to Stanford.
Oh, you did?
And majored in communications, which was the euphemism for journalism in those days.
Was Stanley T. Donner still teaching there at that time?
I don't remember that name.
He was the head of communications when I went there in 1954. So he may have been gone by then.
Yeah, the one that I remember, the professor who stands up in my mind was Chilton Bush. And he had a very distinct way of speaking. And he was a chain smoker, and we loved in his classes to get him off on anecdotal recollections of his days with the New York Times.
Boy.
And his days of New York newspapering, which that was thought to be the Valhalla of newspapering in the world.
New York Times was a big name in those days, still is. A man with a name like that should be on the radio, it seems like.
Chilton Bush?
Yeah.
Except he didn't have a very powerful voice. He didn't have a real broadcast voice. He had kind of an offhand way of tossing off these stories, kind of an understated way, and you wouldn't think of him as having a classic broadcast voice.
No, I wouldn't. Well, KOVR went on the air in 1954, and that was the year I came out of college and began looking for work, and I auditioned for KOVR when it was still in Stockton. And that was one of the most memorable auditions I've ever had in my life. The program director, I'd driven in from San Francisco into the hot valley, and my first experience with that kind of heat, and I was pretty flustered anyway. His first instruction was he handed me a can of Quaker State motor oil, and he told me to ad-lib a minute commercial for that. Well, I stumbled through that okay, and we did something else, I've forgotten what, but the kicker was, and I couldn't believe it, I was listening to this man say this, he said, now I want you to ad-lib a 5-minute newscast on camera.
Ad-lib.
Ad-lib. And I thought to myself, you have to be kidding. But no, he wasn't kidding, and I struggled through that. Fortunately, I had been listening to the radio as I drove in from San Francisco, so I knew what was going on in the world. But I've never experienced that before in my life.
With no copy in front of you.
No copy, no. I didn't get the job, so I guess I didn't do that well.
Well, I'm wondering where they found somebody who could do that well.
I wonder too.
He certainly wasn't working for the station when I started.
And coincidentally, my wife was working for KOVR when I first met her. I was working for KCRA. We got together and we were married in Sacramento, and both of us were employed by competing television stations.
So you have a depth of Sacramento background too.
Yeah, I was there for 6 years. But enough of me. So you were at KOVR and became the correspondent at the Capitol. For how long?
I held that job for, in all, just shy of 6 years. I say in all because it was interrupted. I was fortunate in getting a chance to go back to Stanford as a Stanford Professional Journalism Fellow. That's a program now known as the Knight Fellowship Program, and it was a back-to-school program for mid-career journalists. And there were a dozen of us, and it was just a dream. 2 academic quarters in which you could take virtually any course in the catalog, and not have to be accountable for grades.
Oh,
but
great.
the idea was to enrich you in an area that you had indicated that you might specialize in as a journalist, or an area that was of emerging interest in the coverage of news. I remember we were there just before Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China, and China was a very hot topic, and Stanford had a very hot young China expert named Harry Harding, and we not only took courses from him, we managed to corral him for our own little seminar group that met weekly, and he went on to become, as China opened up and it became a big field of interest journalistically, Harry Harding went on to become one of the renowned China experts in the world. And we had him first.
Boy, a real coup.
Indeed, we thought so.
Now at KOVR, you stayed there how long?
Actually, my employer was after a while was the Umbrella, the McClatchy Broadcasting Organization, which of course no longer exists per se anymore. And when I came back from my 6 months at Stanford, I worked another 6 months or so for my old job covering politics, and CBS beckoned. And
you say beckoned. They heard you, heard of you?
Well, I had begun looking around a bit, and CBS, of course, was generally referred to as the Tiffany Network, and I never dreamed that I'd work for them, but left a resume in the Los Angeles bureau at some stage, and at some stage, some weeks later, got a phone call and a series of interviews and audition tapes, and lo and behold, at the end of 1972, I found myself working for the Tiffany Network in New York.
In New York?
But in those days, CBS sort of had a career ladder that for young reporters usually started out in New York as a reporter-assignment editor. And you spent 3 or 4 days of the week out in the field working as a reporter, and a couple of days on the assignment desk learning the CBS world and the logistics of putting gathering in the news. And you in those days, CBS and the other networks had a lot of bureaus overseas, so you learned that you got a primer in all aspects of a network operation.
Gave you a wonderful background.
It did. It was a great way to get into to network broadcasting. And Walter Cronkite was then the anchor, as he was until 1981, when Dan Rather took over. And it was CBS was in the eyes of the world, a big player in the broadcasting world, and yet you had a sense of a kind of tight little CBS family. The broadcast center in New York was not very fancy. The assignment desk area shared space with the radio operation, and was in a tightly confined area. And right next door, through a couple of doors, was the rather small studio where Walter Cronkite did the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite every night.
On West 57th Street, yeah?
That's right.
Yep.
And everybody bumped into everybody all day long, and very, very soon you knew everybody. And it was an exciting time for somebody who'd come from a different coast and cut his teeth on local operations.
Now, you had done television reporting in Sacramento. Now you're back in radio.
But no, this is, I'm doing both.
You're doing both.
In those days, there was, every CBS correspondent was expected to do both.
Uh-huh.
And the job in terms of the time involved was more television than radio, but everybody was expected to contribute to the radio network.
I see.
And we all did.
Mm-hmm.
And the radio operation was right there in the same newsroom that served the same assignment area that served the television operation.
Mm-hmm.
And a correspondent was a correspondent, whether it was radio or television.
Interesting. Because I think of some of the people who did long-running radio shows like Christopher Glenn, right?
Mm-hmm. Chris Glenn.
Did he ever do a television show?
He did a prize-winning television show.
Oh, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the news.
In the news.
Uh-huh. It was probably the best news broadcast tailored for kids
Mm-hmm.
that was ever put on the air, and it was much decorated in terms of broadcast awards. And Chris, of course, is a bright, wonderful person with a voice that's out of this world, and he was just perfect for that broadcast. Chris has been perfect for a lot of things. He is a model for a lot of broadcast journalists, and deservedly so.
Just retired last year or earlier this year, I forgot.
Yes, just in recent months. But I would recommend to every aspiring radio or television journalist who is looking for a model of wonderful live coverage, two things: Chris Glenn's coverage of the first shuttle launch, live coverage of the first shuttle launch, and Chris Glenn's coverage of the Challenger disaster. He was wonderful at space, especially wonderful at space, and those two were really excellence in the face of extreme pressure.
Boy, I guess. Wow. Well, so many of the CBS on-air talents seem to be so well versed in almost anything. I mean, the backgrounds must have been terrific. Like you say, they made you get well-grounded in the entire journalism field, not just in one particular specialty.
You're expected to do your homework.
Yeah.
You're expected to do your homework. And it's one of the things that's improved through the years with technology is the ability to do your homework. Along came Lexis, so that before you went out on a story, you could go into a data bank and pull out other things that have been written on the subject. And now, of course, the internet is just made so many things accessible. The danger with the internet is that I teach a course at USC, and the internet is such a creature of this young generation that's coming along that they tend to rely on it excessively. They tend to believe in it excessively, and if it's on the internet, it must be true.
Yeah, but it's not always validated, is it?
That's right.
Yeah. I was wondering, I remember a friend of mine, while I was working in Sacramento in the early 60s, was selected by NBC to go with them, but the requirement was to have a master's degree in journalism, and they actually paid for him to go to Columbia University and pick up his master's degree. Was that ever a requirement or anything like that at CBS?
Never was. In fact, there are some notable exceptions. Shouldn't say notable exceptions. There are some notable cases of journalists at CBS, prominent reporters who never finished the basic bachelor's degree.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. You encounter those. And one of the other things I remember during, I guess it was my last interview before I was offered a job at CBS, I asked the then executive editor of CBS, Lee Townsend, wonderful guy, from his bootstraps, New York journalist with another guy with a lot of New York stories to tell. And I remember asking him, I said, how high a valence does CBS place on the cosmetics of this business? You know, a good voice and a good performing quality, good television demeanor. And he said, not very much. He says, we figure if they can write, they can get the rest. And I remember he told me at that point, he said, you know, we had a guy in here about a year ago, and he had this whiny Brooklyn accent you wouldn't believe, but he could write like Shakespeare.
Mm.
We hired him, and he's over in Vietnam right now. The Vietnam War was on at that time.
Yeah.
They were talking about Bob Simon, who's become one of the premier correspondents in broadcast journalism. And Simon can still write like Shakespeare.
Yeah, he can write very well. Oh, man. And writing, unfortunately, is one of the crafts that seems to be so lacking in many of the younger generation on the air.
That's right. And it's so important. I still say, if you can't write, you don't belong on the air.
That's right. Another thing that just drives me up a wall every time I hear it, and I hear it so many times here in Los Angeles on television stations that are supposedly flagship stations, the reporters frequently emphasize the wrong words, particularly any form of to be.
Mm-hmm.
The president will join the first lady, or he is expected to be, punching the wrong word completely destroys the meaning of the sentence.
When I hear one of my students do that, I refer them to Charles Osgood, who is about as good on the air as anybody today and is an excellent writer. And I've watched Charlie produce broadcasts, and he takes a script and he goes through it, and he's done thousands and thousands and thousands of broadcasts, but he still goes through it, and he marks the words that he's going to emphasize and punch up.
Good for him. That's the way it was done in my day, too. Yeah.
And Mike Wallace, as seasoned, to put it mildly, a correspondent as he is and was, he goes out on an interview for 60 minutes and he writes out a list of questions. He doesn't count on just ad-libbing a bunch of questions. He's organized. He's thought it through. He knows what he wants to get out of a subject, and he's organized his interview in order to get it.
Yeah.
And he usually does.
Oh, indeed he does. And sometimes more than he may have thought he would get.
That's right.
What a guy. Well, you were in New York then for some very interesting times. I've only been to the CBS Production Center? What is it called?
Broadcast Center.
Twice. But both times were kind of interesting. The first time, Dr. Frank Stanton had retired that day.
Oh.
And his letter saying goodbye to the staff was being floated around, so I got to see that. And the second time, Walter Cronkite was in Vietnam, ready to file his first report back for the CBS Evening News. But it was now 2 minutes before airtime, and they couldn't get through to him. I mean, there was no signal yet. And everybody in the control room was going crazy, not knowing what the heck they were going to do if they couldn't get Cronkite on the air for that particular broadcast. I think, as I recall, it came up about like 20 or 15 seconds before airtime, and they were able to get him on, but it was some trying times in that control room.
Well, in those days, the logistics of getting on the air out of Vietnam or any place around the world, that was a whole job in itself. Sometimes, in much of the Vietnam era, they shot film. It was film in those days. They shot film out of the field, out wherever the action was, brought it back to Saigon, loaded it on a plane that flew to Hong Kong, where there was a ground station that could access the satellite. But of course, that was no guarantee that you're going to be able to do all that.
No. If everything went well, you could.
And sometimes you were shipping film, all the way to San Francisco in order to get access to landlines to New York. It was, by today's standards, where you can set up a couple of suitcases and satellite out of the Sahara Desert. Why, it was pretty primitive stuff.
Indeed. I'm just curious. You went from Stanford University, and you were in the Bay Area, but you never worked in San Francisco itself.
I worked while I was at Stanford. I cheated. You actually weren't supposed to work, but I had an offer to work on the weekends at KRON, the NBC affiliate in San Francisco, as a writer. And just to keep my hand in the business, I did that on weekends. And occasionally I was a writer/reporter. If there was no other reporter around, I'd run out and cover whatever the story was.
Yeah. Did you find it more interesting to cover any story in the field as opposed to sitting in the studio and reading wire copy or rewriting wire copy?
Oh, I'm a field reporter.
I am.
That's my instinct. That's I think my talent. Anchoring was never to me a great enticement, simply because I like to be out where the action was. I like to be out, sniffing the air around the news and really seeing it happen. I tell people that being a network reporter is a terrific job. You get paid to be a spectator to some of the major events of your age. And, what's better than that?
Oh, absolutely. The old adage about having a nose for news is certainly one that has carried a lot of people through to professional careers of note.
Oh, yes.
And those who don't have that nose for news usually fall flat on their face eventually.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Although there are some news readers or news anchors here in Los Angeles, I wonder if they've ever been on a story in their life, the way the story is read on the air. You were in New York then how long?
I was in New York just over a year and got transferred back out to the West Coast for my first incarnation in the Los Angeles Bureau, which was a Western regional bureau covering the western chunk of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, which were some of the choicest assignments.
Boy, I guess.
And sometimes involving coverage that wasn't, strictly speaking, the western region of the United States, like Asia and Mexico. So it was a hard traveling bureau in those days. You spent a lot of time on the road, and the West I love the West. It's a place of great diversity, as we all know, and ranges from the financial center of San Francisco to the entertainment capital in Southern California to some of the greatest environmental stories and some of the great environmental battles have been waged here in the West. And certainly some of the most marvelous scenery anywhere in the world.
Unparalleled.
I think Alaska is just priceless, and there's so much in the West. And I used to marvel at how often I was getting paid to look at beautiful scenery.
Don't say this too loud. We don't want more people from the East moving out
That's
here.
right. That's right.
Oh, boy. Well, the Los Angeles CBS Radio Bureau was located where? In Columbia Square? Or?
Well, there wasn't theoretically a radio bureau here until I established it in 1992.
Oh.
Again, the correspondence in the bureau here was an all-purpose bureau and served radio and television. That bureau is located in Television City at Fairfax and Beverly.
Oh, it is.
When I established the radio bureau itself, that was done at Columbia Square because they had better radio facilities, full-blown radio facilities in the person of KNX.
Yeah, right.
And KNX was in effect my host, and a good one, and a helpful one, and
no longer on Columbia Square.
No longer in Columbia Square.
Things do change.
Moved on to the digital world down on Wilshire Boulevard.
Oh my gosh, where are they? I read.
They're on Wilshire Boulevard, in the Miracle Mile section of Wilshire.
Okay.
And they, and this has been a difficult pill for the purists to swallow, but KFWB and KNX are on the same floor of that building, separated by a short passageway.
Wow.
Of course, owned by the same organization, but there was always the sense among KNXers, and certainly among those who worked for KFWB, that there was a competition there, a friendly competition, but it was a competition.
Yes.
And you certainly, when you were out on a story, you wanted to do better than the other station did.
Right.
And so it was, as I say, a tough pill for many to swallow when they moved into essentially the same floor, the same building.
A little confusing to the listener on the air, I must say, too.
Yes, I'm sure.
Because the sound, certainly, of KNX has changed considerably over the last couple of years. I live in Thousand Oaks, so I really can't get KFWB that well. But I assume it has changed also. Yeah.
It's, well, one big change on KFWB, it's now the station of the Dodgers. And
that's
so
true. Yeah.
There's a big chunk for 7 months or so out of the year. There's a big chunk of that broadcast time that's baseball.
Now, all this time that you're moving around and doing a lot of traveling, are you a married man yet?
I am. As a matter of fact, my second stint at Stanford gave me not only a second chance at education, but gave me a wife of now 34 years.
No, from out of Stanford.
She was at Stanford on a postdoctoral medical fellowship, and I was there on a journalism fellowship.
Wow.
And we met at the mailbox of a big apartment complex where independently we had taken up residence.
Well, that's a wonderful meeting place, as it turned out.
As it turned out, it certainly was.
So she had to follow you around a bit.
Well, I dragged her to Latin America.
Did you? Where?
After a couple of years here in the L.A. Bureau, I was asked if I wanted to try my hand at covering Latin America, including opening a bureau, which we opened in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Oh, really?
And that was a place to hang my hat and maintain a packed suitcase because I had a whole continent and a half to cover, Central and South America, and it was a heavy dose of traveling.
What years would those have been?
That would have been late 75 to the middle of 78.
Okay.
And they were interesting years in Latin America. They were tough years in Latin America. It was an age of, an era of repressive governments, including the host government in Argentina, which was a military junta, which just as I arrived there had taken power in a coup that threw out the second Peronist government. And next door was Chile with Augusto Pinochet in power, who is maybe the toughest, most steely-eyed man I've ever interviewed in my life.
Really?
And you had another military-backed government next door to the north in Brazil, and democracy was having a hard time making it in those days. But it was also a period of transition, and I was still covering Latin America when the first seeds of revolution were planted in Nicaragua, and the Sandinistas began there. What ultimately was a successful struggle to oust the Somoza regime and come to power themselves. And of course, it was a very interesting time in terms of America's fortunes in Latin America, because one of my big stories was covering the negotiations and ultimately the signing of the Panama Canal treaties. And I was spending a lot of time shuttling from Buenos Aires to Panama City, 7.5 hours.
It's a long flight.
On a direct flight, if you can get one.
Yeah. Well, I can empathize with that because I spent 12 years in Panama as the program director of the Armed Forces Radio and TV network there.
That's right.
And that was just before all this began, although the treaty negotiations really began in about 1972, as I recall, with Henry Kissinger coming down and looking into the possibilities.
It was not an overnight process.
No, it was not. And, of course, there was the sea level canal argument. We could build another canal in perhaps Nicaragua or someplace, and we could maybe do it with atomic means. All of those things that sounded like good ideas to some, but weren't very practical when it came down to push and shove.
That's right. It seems the passage of time, some of those things seem like dreams.
Don't they? Well, who would ever think that it would be a problem for the various species of fish in the two oceans? If there were a sea level canal where they would intermingle, you'd have fish from one side going into the other side, and who knows what would happen then. Little things like that were problems. How long were you then in the Los Angeles bureau of CBS?
Well, my second incarnation in Los Angeles began after my Latin America stint, and began in the middle of 1978. And what a period. In some ways, it feels like my CBS career began anew then, and certainly I had the luxury of being at least based in the same place for the rest of my career, which was from 1978 to 2000, the beginning of 2002 when I retired, being based in the same city, if not being allowed to stay in the same city all the time. But what a period in this region. We had the eruption of Mount St. Helens. We had apart from covering the West, I counted up before you and I started talking, and I guess I've covered all told 7 national political conventions, and covered the vice presidential campaign of the first George Bush, 1984. Covered part of the first Clinton campaign, part of the Dole campaign, unsuccessful campaign against Clinton, and covered the San Francisco earthquake. Happened to be on my way to Candlestick Park to cover the Bay Bridge World Series.
Oh.
When that earthquake hit.
For heaven's sake.
And of course, we've had our own share of earthquakes here to cover.
Yeah, and a few riots.
And we had the riots, which in turn engendered for me covering 3 Rodney King beating trials. There were actually 3.
Wow.
A criminal, civil, and a state criminal, federal criminal, and a civil trial. Covered both O.J. Simpson trials, the criminal and civil trial, and covered the trial of Mikhail Markashev, who was ultimately convicted of killing Bill Cosby's son, Ennis Cosby.
Oh, yes. Oh, but boy, you've covered some big events.
Well, this region just keeps churning out big events.
It does indeed.
It's a great news environment.
Looking back on your several facets of your career, name a couple of very impressive people that you remember, either as colleagues or people that you've covered as a newsmaker.
Oh, I think Ronald Reagan comes to mind immediately. I mean, this is a man who would have ever thought that a man from a college that most people couldn't locate on a map, Eureka College, humble beginnings, would rise through a series of steps to become a despite all the jibes, a significant player in Hollywood, a significant player in politics, and ultimately a president that in many books goes down in history as one of the major presidents of our country's history. And I just think that this is a case of a man accomplishing so much, having risen from humble beginnings. It's just an amazing story. And of course, Ronald Reagan himself knew, and his people always would tell you that the big advantage he had was that he was always being underestimated. Everybody always underestimated Ronald Reagan.
He had that self-effacing charm that would just sort of put everyone at ease, and they never thought about any ambition there, I suppose.
You know, on the other side of the ledger, I must say that I mentioned earlier Augusto Pinochet. You know, spending an hour and a half interviewing him in his office, a man who was one of the toughest, most ruthless dictators ever in Latin America, and sitting across the table and talking to him for an hour and a half. And here I was. I had just come out of a sick bed when his office called and said, "Your interview request has been granted. Can you be here tomorrow?" And so I sat there with the television lights around me, just bathed in sweat. And Pinochet, and I remember he was wearing a rather heavy-looking tweed sport coat, looked very sporty, and obviously he was trying to come off as a nice guy dictator. And he sat across the table from me, and I threw all my toughest questions at him, and he never broke a sweat.
Really? Oh, my darn. Looking at your career in CBS and all of the very interesting colleagues that you've worked with over the years, many of whom have reputations for having high egos, for instance, is there anyone that you would care to name that you would not wish to work with ever again?
That I would not wish to work with?
Not wish to work with?
I don't think I'd wish to answer that question.
Okay. I thought maybe you might not. How about
there have been all kinds, and I don't want to single anybody out as being particularly difficult. Sure, there's some big egos, but part of the territory in network broadcasting is learning to cope with the egos and learning to cope with all kinds. And I can certainly name some of those I'd I'd love to work with again if I ever had the opportunity.
And those would be?
Well, I'll tell you, one of those right at the top of the list is somebody you never heard of, but it was Bob Dunn. He was a big, depending upon his weight regimen at that time, 210 to 300-pound cameraman who had the best eye and the best news instincts and the best edge that I have ever seen. He was just such an asset, and he would always, and he worked until he was well into his 70s, and he would always be out there trying to make this the best story he'd ever shot.
Wow.
And he usually accomplished it. He was so good. He's no longer with us, but
he probably started out shooting film and then moved into videotape.
He started out as a studio cameraman.
Oh, did he? Uh-huh.
Graduated into film and was the first so-called minicam cameraman. They weren't very mini in those days.
No,
that CBS had, and he and a guy named Fred Gayton worked the bugs out of the original minicams, and two very, very gifted guys who just were a wonderful team. And boy, in those early days of shooting with as I say, the so-called minicams, which they packed around with all the accessories that went with them. I had filled the trunk of a car.
Gotcha.
And these guys, we called them the odd couple. This is, there were a lot of failures, and they just kept persisting. And in the first days, why we reporters would sort of feign illness to avoid going out with this very unpredictable technology.
Yeah.
Before long, it was the technology. It was the standard. It was the gold standard.
Sure.
And the rest is history, as they say. And a lot of that is owed to Bob Dunn and Fred Gayton, these two wonderful guys who worked out the bugs.
It's amazing. There are so many people like that we know we know in the industry, but nobody else ever heard of. And they're the backbone of what we can do, and how things have developed these days. So you're teaching at UCS?
USC.
USC.
I teach broadcast reporting and production.
Okay. And eager young people coming along that would hope to be in
yes.
jobs like you had?
Yes, and with a lot more technical savvy than I'll ever have. I had the luxury of working in an environment that had distinct, as you know, divisions of labor, so I never got to lay my hands on an editing console or shoot the camera. I was strictly the reporter. But these kids come along, and they're in a different world where they may well be called upon to be triple threats.
Sure.
And they take to the technical aspects like the proverbial fish in water. And they are taught an Avid editing system, which is very much state of the art.
Right.
USC has spent a lot of money to equip a lab for that, and they learn it with a couple of sessions.
And hopefully they will learn also to write.
Absolutely.
And write well.
Some of us are there to just pound home the importance of doing that very thing.
Wonderful. David, it's been wonderful talking with you today. Anything else that we haven't covered that you want to include in this audio history?
Oh, I think we've pretty much covered the waterfront, and I really appreciate your good leading me through the way. It's my goodness, it seems like such a short time ago that I stepped out of college and jumped with both feet into the world of journalism. And what a fortunate way to what a fortunate life I've had to be able to do that, as I say, to make my living as a paid spectator.
Well, you and I were both fortunate in that sense of being able to identify early on what it was we wanted to do. I didn't know it was a goal. I mean, I didn't think of it as that. I just knew what I wanted to do, and so did you.
One thing we didn't touch on, and usually I'm asked, what's your most memorable story? And I think my most memorable story was in 1979. Just by happen chance, I happened to be in Asia when the flood of refugees poured across the border from Cambodia into Thailand after the fall of Pol Pot in Cambodia. And I was sent there to the Thai-Cambodian border to cover that. And I had never seen such mass human misery in my life. And the impact of seeing so much misery in one place, seeing so many people so broken, so hurt, so sick, and seeing what a whole country had endured for so many years just left an indelible impact on me. And it reminded me also that every story we do is really a people story. Ultimately, every story you cover impacts people in some way, and you need to tell it that way. And I tell my students that, remember, you may think you're doing an economic story, but it's a people story. Ultimately, the economic dynamics you're reporting impact people.
Yes.
And always keep people as part of that story, if not the center of that story.
And that way people will listen to it and pay attention to it. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you again, David. This is Jerry Fry, the audio historian of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, having a delightful conversation with former CBS News correspondent David Dow on this August the 7th, 2006. Thank you very much for listening.